Good afternoon. Well, we want to welcome all of you to Remembering Lee 2013. We're so glad to have all of you with us today. We're also glad to have each of you here to remember the contributions of Robert E. Lee, the 11th president of Washington College, and to learn more about the events that shaped his character and brought him to prominence. Today, we welcome home to Washington and Lee Frank O'Reilly. Frank is an alumnus who received his BA in American History from this institution in 1987, and he received his MA in American History with a concentration in early American military history and Civil War studies from American Military University. Frank has spent the majority of his career working for the National Park Service at the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania and National Military Park as an historian. He has also served as an historical consultant for the city of Fredericksburg. He probably knows more about Fredericksburg than the people who live there. Frank has written numerous articles on the Civil War and the Mexican War for national and international journals. He has appeared in documentaries and has lectured on military history to audiences around the world, including conferences in the United Kingdom and specifically at Oxford. His latest book, The Fredericksburg Campaign, Winter War on the Rappahannock, received a 2003 nomination for the Pulitzer Prize in Letters. The book has received numerous awards, including the James I. Robertson Jr. Book Award, the Daniel Laney Book Award, and the Richard Barksdale Harwell Book Award. He is currently working on a new book, on the Battle of Malvern Hill and the 7 Days campaign around Richmond. So once we get through the sesquicentennial, he might even have time to finish it. When I first met Frank at the Stonewall Jackson Symposium several years ago, that was when he had hair, I knew nothing about his impressive resume. I just found him to be a very engaging speaker. It was when the Jackson House volunteers and staff took a trip to Chancellorsville, however, that I discovered his tremendous talent as an interpreter. He is the first person who ever explained to me Jackson's wounding in a way that made sense. He then took us to Guinea Station and guided us through the events of Jackson's last hours with such pathos that I thought I could hear Jackson breathing as he lay in the bed and the clock ticking on the mantle. This year, as we remember the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Chancellorsville, it occurred to me that Lee's greatest victory is often overshadowed by Jackson's death. Today, we have an opportunity to see the battle through Lee's eyes, from a man who is a noted scholar, a gifted speaker, and a fascinating interpreter. So thank you, Frank, for coming to share with us Adapt, Improvise, and Overcome, Lee's greatest victory at Chancellorsville.
Well, good afternoon. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today to remember the genius and the ability of Robert Edward Lee. When Robert E. Lee came to Lexington on September 18th, 1865, he was greeted with a spontaneous ovation on Main Street. The people along the street, the citizens and students of Lexington, the former soldiers of the Confederacy, they raised a cheer for this aging horseman. But who was the man that generated such a spontaneous outpouring? They did not know him as an educator, not yet. They could not speak of his amicable disposition, his generosity of spirit, or his efforts as a conciliator. None of these attributes would have been common knowledge at that particular moment. The man they applauded was a soldier. Robert E. Lee was respected as one of the great captains of the 19th century. Many had admired him for his perseverance in the darkest days of the Civil War. Many looked on Robert E. Lee as the living embodiment of the Southern Confederacy when victory seemed possible, perhaps even inevitable, against overwhelming and frightful odds, just as long as Lee was there to lead them. His ability, his magic, cast warm memories of such places as Manassas, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. But it was this last place, Chancellorsville, that tied Robert E. Lee to Lexington. Lexington was inextricably linked to that battle fought in May of 1863. Wherever Lee turned in this town, he was met with vestiges of that battle. The only two Confederate generals killed at Chancellorsville were both buried in Lexington. Brigadier General Elijah Franklin Paxton was killed in action leading the Stonewall Brigade. And then there was Lieutenant General Thomas Jonathan Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, one of Lee's closest associates in the entire Civil War. As Lee became acquainted with his college here, he must have learned more about the Liberty Hall Volunteers, the only college company to serve through the entire Civil War, and how they suffered their worst casualties at Chancellorsville. Lee surely would have learned about the neighboring Virginia Military Institute and about Stonewall Jackson's prediction that the Institute will be heard from today at Chancellorsville. In fact, within months of assuming his new position here at Washington College, Lee received a special request from the widow of Stonewall Jackson. She wanted him to review a new biography of her husband, written by the Reverend Robert Louis Dabney. Lee had no time to truly critique the manuscript, but he chose to peruse one chapter, the chapter on Chancellorsville. What was it about Lee and Chancellorsville and Lexington? In the spring of 1863, 150 years ago this very year, Robert E. Lee embarked on his greatest achievement. Chancellorsville also marked the most personal involvement the general ever had interacting with a battle up to that date, in that point in the war. But it also reaped the most bittersweet results for him in the war to date. As the campaign began in April of 1863, Robert E. Lee faced two critical crises, one external and one internal. Externally, he had to deal with the fact that his supplies and logistics around Fredericksburg and the Rappahannock Valley had signally failed. His army was unable to feed itself adequately, and he was dependent upon splitting his forces, parceling them out across Southside Virginia and even into North Carolina. His army diminished in strength from 78,000 to almost 50,000. Another problem was an internal problem. Robert E. Lee faced a new enemy in the spring of 1863, himself and his health. For the first time in his life, Robert E. Lee's health failed him. In February and March of that year, he found himself bedridden for the first time with acute pericarditis, or the first pangs of heart disease, the beginning shot of an ongoing battle that would go for 7 years and ultimately conclude just a few feet from where we meet today in October of 1870. Personal health was a tremendous, frightening experience for Robert E. Lee. He did not know going into Chancellorsville whether he had the stamina to stay up or to stay ahead of his opponent, much last the entire duration of the Civil War. He was facing incredible odds against him. The Union Army, his nemesis, the Army of the Potomac, outnumbered his force 2.5 to 1. And it had a brand new, bold, swaggering commander, an aggressive man known as Joseph Hooker, nicknamed Fighting Joe Hooker. Robert E. Lee used to refer to him in letters derisively by addressing him as Mr. F.J. Hooker for Fighting Joe. Fighting Joe Hooker took the initiative on April 28th and crossed the Rappahannock River just below Fredericksburg. As his forces made an incursion on the Confederate side of the river, fire erupted, and one of Stonewall Jackson's trusted lieutenants, a staff officer named James Powers Smith, went immediately to report to Robert E. Lee. He found Lee still abed, which was unusual in and of itself. As he reported the Union forces across the river, Robert E. Lee twitted the young man, saying, "I thought I heard firing and was beginning to think it was about time some of you young men tell me what it was all about." The term "some of you young men" might have had a bite to it, for at that particular moment, Robert E. Lee was feeling his age and more. But while Lee was questionable in body, he was very sharp in mind. No sooner had the Union forces crossed at Fredericksburg when they abruptly stopped and moved no further. Lee surmised that they were not the main threat. They must have been a ruse to divert his attention away from wherever the main threat was. And as soon as he heard of Union rumblings to the west, in a very densely vegetated area known as the Wilderness, he guessed that that was the main problem. He was able to divide the Confederate Army, keeping a portion of it opposite Fredericksburg to mind the Union forces that had crossed there. And then he rushed the rest of his forces westward to confront the Union Army out in the Wilderness. The first forces that were sent out there were elements of General James Longstreet's corps. But Longstreet was not with Lee during this campaign. He had been detached and sent to Southside Virginia to gather supplies for Lee's army. Neither the supplies nor Longstreet nor the forces with Longstreet would be available for the Chancellorsville battle. The only thing left over from Longstreet's corps were two tiny divisions, led by a South Carolinian named Richard Herron Anderson and a Georgian named Lafayette McLaws. Anderson was the first man on the scene to block the road out of the Wilderness. Lee had not worked with him directly and gave him very explicit, express orders on how to defend the ground against all comers, notifying him that it was now death or victory, for defeat would be their certain destruction. Stonewall Jackson also hurried out to reinforce Anderson and secure the area. But Lee knew Stonewall Jackson so well by 1863 that he didn't have to spell out his orders explicitly. He gave him broad outlines. He gave him deferential orders and allowed him to make his own decisions on the ground. He told him that the ground was critical and that they needed to keep the Union Army away from Fredericksburg. Stonewall Jackson interpreted that not as a defensive order, but as an offensive order, and he attacked the attackers on May 1st, 1863. Hooker was taken aback, and the Union commander pulled all of his forces back into the woods to a very strong piece of defensible ground at a country crossroads called Chancellorsville. Lee wasn't there on May 1st. He had stayed in Fredericksburg to satisfy himself that the Union force there was no threat. He left everything to Stonewall Jackson. Late in the afternoon, he came out and joined Jackson at Chancellorsville. And there, the two great commanders met on the battlefield, the great partnership of the entire Civil War, the synergy between them, so legendary and well known to all of us. And here, in their signature battle, their marquee moment, it is important to note that they did not see eye to eye. As far as Stonewall Jackson was concerned, the Union force in Fredericksburg was a ruse, definitely. But the Union force at Chancellorsville was no different. He had tried to bait them into battle and they had backed away. They were not interested in fighting. They were just a feint. Robert E. Lee did not agree. Lee knew that Hooker was in front of him, and the vast bulk of the Union Army was there too. This was no ruse, but to get Stonewall Jackson on the same page with Robert E. Lee required Lee's great diplomatic skill. He suggested that Jackson might even be right, but they should probably make contingencies should the Union Army change its mind instead. Jackson couldn't argue with that logic, but what they were doing from that point on out was purely an academic exercise, should the Union Army stay. As they compared notes, they reconnoitered the ground, and they realized that Hooker had picked a very strong position. It was high ground, heavily fortified, with limited roads and avenues of approach, all of them brilliantly covered by Union fire. There was no place to strike at the Union Army as far as Lee and Jackson could discern. But as they sat and considered their situation, good news arrived. Confederate cavalry ranging off to the west under Jeb Stuart and Lee's own nephew Fitzhugh had discovered the Union right flank and reported that it was, quote, up in the air, which meant specifically that unlike the rest of the Union line, the Union right flank was not fortified and it was not sitting on any naturally defensible piece of ground. That was the weak link, and Lee instantly drew his attention to it. But it's one thing for scouts to discover it, but it's an entirely different matter to find a way for an army to get around to that flank and exploit it. Union and Confederate armies in the wilderness were flailing blindly. They were unfamiliar with the ground. And Robert E. Lee dispatched couriers and guides and staff officers in every direction to go down every little pig path in the wilderness to find out if it could lead them around to that flank, and if it could be done with an entire army on the march. Among the staff officers who stayed with Lee and Jackson that day, they hovered close, they eavesdropped, trying to gain some kernel of truth and knowledge. One of them became so fixated by what Lee was saying, he leaned in so hard he crowded up against the general. And Lee abruptly stopped talking to Jackson and addressed Jackson's staff officer and said, "Mr. Smith, we are plagued by a masked battery of the enemy, and I desire you to find its location for me at once." The young man dutifully bounded off into the swamps and wandered around for hours until it finally dawned on him that a masked battery would not be easily seen and that he had just been set up. Meanwhile, Lee and Jackson, back at their improvised headquarters, could not come to any conclusions. They had not received any intelligence on how to get around. At one point, Lee found himself absently just pointing his hand towards Chancellorsville and muttering, "How can we get at those people?" And Jackson just answered demurely, "That's for you to say." He still didn't believe that this was anything but an exercise. So Lee abruptly offered to send a battery of artillery out in front of the lines before dawn and shell the Union positions. If the Union Army stayed, they would respond. That exercise was done exclusively for Jackson's benefit. And in fact, the battery did go out and did draw fire, and from 5 a.m. on May 2nd onward, this was no longer an exercise. Stonewall Jackson was on board for a full-blown operation, a military combat action. The generals went to sleep that night, nestled in the woods, using saddles and saddle blankets as their beds. And sometime after midnight, the hapless James Powers Smith came back from looking for his masked battery. Since he had been sent out on a direct order of Robert E. Lee, he had to report, which meant he had to wake Lee up to tell him that he was unable to find the battery. Lee chided the young man, telling him that the young men of his day are just not equal to the young men of Lee's. They would have found that battery. And as Smith drew up in feigned hurt, Lee reached out and grabbed him by the shoulder and drew him in very close. And face to face in the darkness, Lee chuckled, just to let him know he'd been had. Now that doesn't change the course of battles. It certainly doesn't change the course of wars. Or does it? Because I want you to consider that at midnight, May 1st, May 2nd, the Union Army at Chancellorsville had twice as many men as Lee. They held a fortified, defensible position that Lee could not assail. And yet, what was the state of morale in Lee's headquarters? He was joking. Morale was good. It was strong. And it's that morale that would eventually be paid off, because the next morning, May 2nd, there was a solution. Jackson's mapmaker, Jedediah Hotchkiss, returned with a route around the Union Army. As he sat between Lee and Jackson, he traced a 12-mile route that would march the Confederates clean around the Union Army to blindside them. When he was done, Lee asked Jackson 3 vital, important questions. He asked him, "What do you propose to do?" And Jackson traced the exact same route and said, "Go around here." Lee asked him, "What do you propose to make this movement with?" And Jackson answered, "My entire corps." Now keep in mind that Longstreet wasn't there, just a small vestige of his corps. So Lee asked, "What will you leave me?" And Jackson answered, "The divisions of Anderson and McLaws, the part of Longstreet's command." Lee thought about it for only a moment before he said, "Well, go on." And that unleashed Stonewall Jackson. But I want you to think about this. Not a year before, Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee had not worked together. Not a year before, Robert E. Lee had not even commanded an army. And now they were going to embark on this. In 1862, a young artillerist asked somebody familiar with Lee what he was like. And he was told that Lee's name alone might mean audacity. And on May 2nd, 1863, that certainly was coming to fruition. Because Robert E. Lee was dividing his army in the face of an aggressive enemy. He wasn't dividing it into 2 pieces. He was dividing it into 3. For he had left 10,000 Confederates back in Fredericksburg under General Jubal Early to watch his rear. He had sent 27,000 Confederates off down a wormhole that led through the wilderness with Stonewall Jackson. And he stayed with 13,000 Confederates to defy the attention of 75 to 80,000 Union soldiers. And he was willing to make that move. But I want you to also appreciate not only the high drama of this decision, but the professionalism of this decision. Because so often we have a tendency to make it almost Hollywood-esque and say that Jackson and Lee were the ultimate gamblers. And what they were doing was genuinely risky, but it was not a gamble. There is a big difference. In fact, a risk is something that is predicated on calculations. A gamble is something that relies on chance or luck, and luck is not a strategy. It is interesting to note that if the Union Army should suddenly awake to its opponent's movements, that the Confederates had a way to get away. Stonewall Jackson would have been on a road known as the Brock Road. Instead of going north against the Union Army, he could have easily turned south and gone to Spotsylvania Courthouse, not 8 miles away. Jubal Early at Fredericksburg, if he found himself beset, was on the direct road to Spotsylvania Courthouse, 10 miles away. And even Robert E. Lee had an interior road that would take him to Spotsylvania, and he could reconstitute his entire army in just a half-day's march. So he was planning and calculating, and those calculations all added up to the willingness to take the risk. Jackson's march started at 7 a.m. on May 2nd. Lee watched the column file past him for hours. At one point, Stonewall Jackson rode up, and the 2 generals rode off to the side of the road, away from their staff. No one could hear what they said. No one knows what was said. But observers noted at one point that Lee just pointed down the road, or rather Jackson did, and Lee nodded. Jackson saluted, and then Jackson was off. These two couldn't have known it, but that would be their last meeting in this world. The next time that they would be in any close proximity to each other in body would be when they were here at Lexington after the war. May 2nd is a story that is often focused and fixated on Stonewall Jackson and Stonewall Jackson's flank march and Stonewall Jackson's flank attack. But in fact, May 2nd was Robert E. Lee's greatest day as a general. It was certainly the busiest day he ever had in the entire war. Robert E. Lee showed a tremendous adaptability. He wore every hat a commander can wear on a battlefield. He was an Army commander who made decisions to divide his army. He was a Corps commander responsible for the divisions of Anderson and McLaws and keeping Hooker's attention. He was in fact a brigade commander who literally ran regiments up to the skirmish line, engaged the Federals until it could escalate to the point where the Federals were willing to commit, and then he would back off only to do it again somewhere else, just to keep them off balance. In fact, at one point he was a regimental commander with the 6th Virginia Infantry, deciding on which companies should go forward and which should hold in reserve. At one point he even became a battery commander when he decided that an artillery unit was not capable under a certain circumstance. He removed them from the line of battle. He did all these things hands-on in one day. As Jackson's flank march wound through the wilderness, Hooker did spot it, and a division of Union forces lashed out and struck at its rear at a place called Catherine's Iron Furnace. Stonewall Jackson wasn't about to be baited into a premature fight and ignored it and kept on going. But Robert E. Lee heard this firefight and did something extraordinary. His forces were spread paper thin, but he committed an entire brigade of troops, a couple thousand men, to engage that Union Federal division and keep it off of Stonewall Jackson, keep the attention focused on him. When the Federals started to bring in more reinforcements, Robert E. Lee committed a 2nd Brigade. He upped the ante, and it had a brilliant experience. For at that point, the Union commander overcommitted. For the price of about 4,000 Confederates, the Union Army committed 20,000 Union soldiers to an irrelevant corner of the battlefield and away from where Stonewall Jackson would strike. It also created a mindset with the Union commander, who noted that Stonewall Jackson's forces were proceeding south, away from the battlefield, and that they were uninterested in turning around and fighting. But Robert E. Lee was aggressive, and General Hooker came to the conclusion it was because the retreat route went through Catherine's Furnace, and that he had cut Lee off. In fact, it would be that mindset that the Confederates are retreating that would serve the Confederates extremely well that day. In fact, Robert E. Lee could do no wrong on May 2nd, even when he made egregious mistakes. They worked out to his advantage. Keep in mind that his forces were now divided into 3 parcels. And as he had an understanding with Jackson that they could reunite at Spotsylvania, someone needed to go back to Fredericksburg and tell Jubal Early. Lee sent his chief of staff, Robert Chilton, to tell Jubal Early that he had discretionary orders, that if he needed to fall back, he should fall back on Lee. Unfortunately, the order was not written down, and Robert Chilton rode 12 miles to Fredericksburg and somehow got the order convoluted in his mind, so that by the time he arrived, he told General Early it was a peremptory order and that he must obey immediately. It didn't make sense, but it was a direct order, and Jubal Early was compelled to abandon the most fortified, strong position in all of Virginia, Marye's Heights and its dreaded stone wall, in broad daylight without a battle. And the Union Army saw that. Why would the Confederates abandon something so impregnable without a fight? Unless Hooker was right. It was a retreat, and the Confederates were abandoning the Rappahannock Valley. When Robert Chilton explained that he had trouble with Jubal Early, Robert E. Lee gave him even more trouble and said he didn't want Early with him, make him go back. Jubal Early dutifully turned around and resumed his positions, but didn't resume them until 6 p.m. By that point, even Joe Hooker knew Lee wasn't retreating. Jackson's flank attack had started about an hour before. Throughout the day, Lee had kept endless pressure on Joseph Hooker, but at the same time, Lee constantly moved up and down the line, trying desperately to hear any sound of Jackson's progress, the commitment of his attack. He started to distrust his own ears, and he turned to younger men, asking if they could hear anything to the west. But when Jackson struck at 5:15, it was a resounding crescendo that even Robert E. Lee could hear. And at that point, he launched a general assault all across his front. He was weaker than his opponent, but it was vitally important to keep Hooker off balance. If he was dealing with Lee, he could not bleed off reinforcements and deal with Stonewall Jackson. This went into the twilight, into the darkness, into the night. Stonewall Jackson's flank attack was a great success, as you're all familiar with. But the end of the flank attack still left Robert E. Lee in great peril. His army was still divided. His army was now weaker for having been in combat. And they had the Union Army between Lee and Jackson. And then things got worse. At about 11 o'clock that night, one of Jackson's staff officers, a signal officer named Robert Wilburn, showed up in Lee's headquarters to announce that Stonewall Jackson had been accidentally shot by the mistaken fire of his own men. An hour later, Jedediah Hotchkiss of Jackson's staff also arrived with the same news, and Lee instantly shut him off. He did not want to hear it. He said the news is too painful. But when he heard that Jackson's successor was Jeb Stuart, Lee told Hotchkiss to immediately return to the other wing of the army to give him direct orders to attack at dawn. May 3rd, 1863 is often overlooked in history, and that's unfortunate. Historically, the perception has been that Stonewall Jackson's flank attack won the Battle of Chancellorsville, and everything that followed was a foregone conclusion. But in truth, it was nothing of the sort. May 2nd and the flank attack had created an opportunity for Lee to either escape the overwhelming clutches of his enemy or to consider seeking a decisive conclusion on the battlefield. Lee was never in doubt about what he would do with that opportunity. He committed himself and his army to the decisive result, and he committed everyone around Chancellorsville to one of the most intense bloodlettings of all American history. Lee was more aggressive and tenacious and adaptable on May 3rd than I've ever seen him historically portrayed before or after. He gave orders to Jeb Stuart to strike directly at Chancellorsville, and he would do the same from the other side. Stuart from the west, Jackson, or rather Lee from the east. If they could force the Union Army to retract its lines, then they could reach out and find each other and reunite the Confederate Army. That was absolutely vital for their survival. The attack started at 5 a.m. There was no maneuver to it. There were brutal, blunt, frontal assaults that went right at the heart of the Union position. The losses were appalling. The attrition, amazing. The largest division that the Confederate Army had on the field was that of General Ambrose Powell Hill, A.P. Hill. A.P. Hill went down wounded shortly after Jackson's fall. A shell had clipped across his calves and left him with a freak wound. It didn't break the skin, but bruised him so badly he was no longer able to mount a horse. No longer mobile, he was no longer in command. His replacement was General Harry Heath, and Henry Heath as a prelude to his experience in Gettysburg, promptly got shot in the head on May 3rd. His replacement was General William Dorsey Pender. Pender was a human lightning rod who was wounded in every single battle he was in, and Chancellorsville was no different. He was shot in the arm. And his replacement was a brigadier general named James J. Archer, the largest division in Lee's entire army, and it went through 4 commanders. And that was just the beginning. Other brigades managed to keep their commanders, or divisions kept theirs, but their commands ceased to exist. General James H. Lane of North Carolina had about 2,000 men in ranks on May 3rd. He lost 910 of them. He lost 13 of his 14 field officers. He lost his entire staff. And he lost his little brother, Roker Lane. His brigade suffered the highest loss of any brigade, north or south, at Chancellorsville. General Elijah Franklin Paxton, commander of the Stonewall Brigade, was killed at this time, leading his men into the maelstrom. What are the odds that out of the entire Confederate Army in Northern Virginia, that represents every state of the Southern Confederacy, with the exception of Arkansas at this point, and Texas, as they are on detached duty, that the only 2 fatalities among general officers come out of one little peaceful town? This town, Lexington. Brigades went through 3, 4, 5 commanders in about as many minutes of combat. Divisions became inextricably mixed. Death and chaos literally swirled and filled the wilderness. Hour after hour of intense attack after attack. It brutalized the Union Army, but it also brutalized the Confederate attackers. In the end, they fought from 5 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., and 18,000 casualties accumulated in just 5 hours. That's an average of 1 casualty every minute, or rather every second of combat. No one had ever experienced that intensity of combat among American soldiers to that point. This destruction was just simply out of control. May 3rd, 1863 was the bloodiest Sunday in all of American military history. It was the bloodiest morning of all American history. But finally, the Confederates gained a decisive edge when they seized a piece of rare opening and high ground amidst these trees, a place called Hazel Grove, an ideal platform for artillery. And it's there that the Confederates put a tremendous amount of effort together. They massed dozens of cannons at this point, and they completely unhinged the Federal defense at Chancellorsville. It was also at Hazel Grove that the Confederates were able to reunite the wing of Lee with the wing of Jeb Stuart. But even with this decisive moment, this was still a deadly locale in the very thick of combat, and Lexington again paid the price. Among the Confederate artillery commanders was a captain named Greenlee Davidson. The Davidsons sent 4 sons to war. 3 of them were killed during the war. One of them, Frederick, was killed at Manassas in the first major battle of the Civil War. One of them, Augustus, was killed at Appomattox in the last battle of the war. And Greenlee, giving an eerie symmetry to all of this, fell precisely at the midpoint of the war between them. It's regrettable that their 4th brother survived the war, but he didn't survive long, for he succumbed to typhoid fever and died very abruptly in 1869 while attending the Virginia Military Institute. The Davidsons are buried not very far away from where we are right now. Lexington had paid another price. Amidst all this, Robert E. Lee was prescient. He had an amazing ability to divorce himself from the suffering, from the death, and to keep himself focused, but also to keep a bigger picture. It was amidst this that a young staff officer named Heros von Borke admired Robert E. Lee amidst all this battle. He said that the general was looking as calm and dignified as ever, and perfectly regardless of the shells bursting around him and the solid shot plowing up the ground in all directions, including right beneath Lee's horse Traveler. In fact, Lee seemed so relaxed that he made others too relaxed. A Prussian observer, Captain Justus Scheibert, took this most inopportune moment amid battle to seek an interview with Robert E. Lee. As the young Prussian advanced towards the general, perhaps anticipating him, preempted him with a rather quixotic question. He said, "Look at all these young men. What can they do to better themselves when this war is over?" The young Prussian had no idea what to make of this and just blinked. And then Lee answered his own question and said, perhaps education would be the answer. The great historian and bard Douglas Southall Freeman points out that the Orange Plank Road on the battlefield leads west to Lexington. As the Confederates launched one final attack, they overwhelmed the Union defenses, drove them out of Chancellorsville, left the Union headquarters there a burning hulk. And as the Confederates converged from all points of the compass at this point, Robert E. Lee rode into their midst, anxious to restore order, anxious to maintain the initiative, anxious to keep the attack alive, even amidst the chaos and confusion. But his men were exhausted, and their commanders were gone. And as they saw Lee ride into their midst, they exploded in an outpouring of emotion. It was interesting to note that the men cheered Robert E. Lee as he rode into that clearing. One of the staff officers, Charles Marshall, wrote that the wounded men raised their weak and feeble voices, and they melded with the strong, hearty voices of the men in the ranks. And together, they swelled the clearing and filled the air. And it was from moments such as these that I imagine that men of ancient times were raised to the stature of gods. What a sublime statement. But it wasn't what Lee wanted. Lee wanted the attack to go forward, not for them to cheer. It is more important for us, though, to recognize that they cheered Lee at the moment in the cachet of his greatest victory. This is not some post-war accretion. It happened in real time. It is also important to note that the soldiers rarely cheered Robert E. Lee. They cheered the likes of Stonewall Jackson, but they treated Lee with quiet deference. But this was the first day that the Army of Northern Virginia would fight without Stonewall Jackson. And they had found seamlessly their answer to that loss in Robert E. Lee. Lee had come full of age at that moment. But Lee wanted more than just the burned out hulk of the federal headquarters to justify the extreme losses he had sustained. Before he could launch one last fatal final attack, he had to break it off. The Union force in Fredericksburg that had been so docile had suddenly become reanimated and had punched through and was heading directly for Chancellorsville. Lee had to bracket off Hooker's forces and deal with this new threat head on. He confronted it at a place called Salem Church, where he was able to back the Union Army up against the Rappahannock River. Regrettably, the Confederates were exhausted, fatigued, and mentally drained as well. The Confederates were unable to launch a decisive final blow. The Union forces woke up to their fears and were able to escape back across the river. And Lee was livid. According to one soldier, he put it rather tamely, he was in a decidedly bad humor. But Lee also showed a tremendous resilience because he didn't linger on that. He recognized that he had lost an opportunity, but he also recognized that there was still one to be had. For Hooker was still at Chancellorsville with his back to the Rappahannock River. He hurried his forces back for one final, decisive blow, a blow that would be landed on May 6th. But it never happened, because under cover of darkness, Joseph Hooker retreated across the Rappahannock and pulled up his bridges and left. The Confederates under Lee were not excited about making this attack. They didn't even attempt to disguise their relief when they found the Union lines abandoned. And one of the generals, Dorsey Pender, now recovering from his wounded arm 3 days before, went to Lee and explained that the Union Army was gone. And Lee exploded at the young brigadier. He said, "That is just like you young men, General Pender. I tell you what to do, but you don't do it. Go after them." But that was frustration, for there was nothing to go after. Lee had overcome incredible odds. He had mastered the battlefield. He had driven the Union Army. But this was also his greatest frustration. Lee showed tremendous cunning at Chancellorsville, true audacity, determination. He was able to overcome these immense odds of 3 or 2.5 to 1. He was marvelously adaptable to the circumstances as they presented themselves to him. His battle was fluid, and so was Robert E. Lee. He was magnificently exploitive. He changed his objective repeatedly to exploit every opportunity that presented itself at Chancellorsville. On May 1st, his objective was to drive the Union Army back across the Rappahannock River. On May 2nd, it was to make sure that the Union Army never got back across the Rappahannock River. On May 3rd, it was to reunite the divided wings of the Confederate Army. And once that was done, it was once again back to destroying the Union Army in toto. Lee did everything at Chancellorsville, and he did everything well. It was a superlative moment and recognized in real time. One Confederate thought that Lee's performance was little short of a miracle. And Chancellorsville was rightly called Lee's greatest victory. And it became an inspiration to his generation, and I might add to every single generation of American soldiers since. There's a good reason that General Norman Schwarzkopf attributed his success in the Persian Gulf to emulating the movements of Lee and Jackson. That movement specifically was the movement of Chancellorsville. But this was also a bittersweet experience. Lee had lost 14,000 veteran troops and seasoned commanders at Chancellorsville. He lost his most trusted executive officer, Stonewall Jackson. Lee could ill afford to suffer such extreme losses and hope to endure a protracted war. And what did Lee achieve for his greatest victory? It didn't end the war. It didn't even shorten the war. The Union Army was still intact. It was still in the field. So what did it do? Well, it lent credence to an idea of the invincibility of the Confederate Army. It added to the war weariness of the North, who began to doubt whether they could ever triumph in this war. It legitimized a burgeoning Democratic Peace Party that would potentially impact an upcoming presidential election in 1864. And while Chancellorsville created all of these possibilities, Chancellorsville fully failed to define any one of those possibilities in and of itself. So what did Lee do? What did Chancellorsville mean? Would all depend on what Lee did with it, what he did next. So predictably, the audacious Robert Edward Lee was on the offensive within days of the Chancellorsville battle, carrying the war northward in the summer of 1863 into Pennsylvania, searching for the decisive results that had started in the woods of Chancellorsville and led him to the fields of Gettysburg. Perhaps the fondest legacy of Chancellorsville came from Lee's very simple quixotic question: how could these young men improve themselves once the war was over? The question found a truly decisive answer when Lee came to Lexington and became the president of Washington College. Lee's leadership skills and what became the bedrock and the hallmark of this university and its student body perhaps germinated from a simple thought on the battlefield at Chancellorsville. Washington and Lee University, its students, its faculty, are the continuing legacy of Robert E. Lee, and in a way, a legacy of his greatest victory at Chancellorsville. Perhaps in the final analysis, Washington and Lee University is the tangible proof that Chancellorsville was indeed Lee's greatest victory. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. We're going to take just a minute or two, about 7 minutes we have, for some questions if you would like to ask Frank. And we are putting microphones here in the aisles. If you have a question, please go to the microphone and ask it so we can all benefit from the question and the answer. So, let me just say this. At the end of the question and answer period, Frank, myself, Pat Hobbs, and Peter Grover will escort him out for luncheon, and we thank you for your attendance as well.
Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, ideas, comments? You have just gone through a major battle and you look as exhausted.
Thank you for a very inspiring talk. I just wondered, how did it happen that exactly 1 year later, wilderness, there was another meeting? Was there any reason why exactly 1 year later the troops met again at that same spot?
Excellent question. The question is, these armies fought in May of 1863 amidst the woods of the wilderness, and almost precisely a year to the date later, they'll do it again on the very same piece of ground, in a battle that became known specifically and significantly as the Wilderness. And there is a very good reason for that, and that is that the entire area between Fredericksburg and the Wilderness is critical ground to both the Union and the Confederate Army. Fredericksburg sits at the midpoint between the two opposing capitals. Washington is only 50 miles north, and Richmond was only 50 miles south. The Union Army wanted to drive south through that corridor to not only strike at the Confederate capital, but to also protect Washington while they do it. Of course, the politicians in Washington liked that idea a great deal and were quick to endorse it. But the Confederates were also key about keeping this piece of ground, to keep the Union Army as far away from Richmond as possible. And they had a perfect ally, for in that area was the Rappahannock and the Rapidan rivers, two major east-west watercourses and obstacles to the Union advance. Any Union army that would drive south would have to cross those rivers, and it would slow them down and bottleneck them, giving the Confederates an opportunity in which they could mass their forces and crowd them up against the river. It worked at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. It worked again at Chancellorsville in May 1863, and would work to a degree in May of 1864 at the Wilderness. The big difference at this point is that in 1864, the Union's supreme commander was Ulysses S. Grant, And Grant, unlike his predecessors, simply could not retreat. So he sidestepped the roadblock at the Wilderness and pressed his luck further south. And thus they started a crab-like campaign that marched its way across the entire state of Virginia to Richmond, to Petersburg, and ultimately to Appomattox. But the reason that the woods are such a compelling area of fighting is simply because where it sits on the big map of Virginia. Great question. Well, here's a question. The question's been raised about Stonewall Jackson's successor on the battlefield, James Ewell Brown Stuart. Jeb Stuart was placed in command of Jackson's corps after Jackson was wounded and General A.P. Hill was incapacitated. That created a crisis in Jackson's corps. Turns out that all the surviving generals were mere brigadiers, and none of them prepared to elevate themselves 2 grades above themselves. At that particular moment, Jeb Stuart happened to be the only ranking major general on that part of the field. So by dint of his commission, he took command in the crisis. He had fully earned the right to the corps, and the corps was quite smitten with his abilities. But regrettably for General Stuart, he was not going to become the successor of Stonewall Jackson. He would not inherit the corps. He would not get the promotion to lieutenant general, because he had proved himself even more invaluable as a cavalry officer, as an intelligence officer. Somebody else would have to be the successor to Stonewall Jackson, but nobody else could be the successor to Jeb Stuart in 1863. By his great ability, Jeb Stuart, in fact, had doomed himself to only commanding a cavalry corps and never rising above major general. It's one of the regrettable aspects of it. Good question. Yeah, I believe you had a question, sir.
I'm going to ask you to comment on Hooker's personal command of the battle.
The Union commander, General Joseph Hooker. I've been asked to comment on his personal command on the field. Joseph Hooker was an arrogant, egotistical, self-centered officer, but he was also a brilliant administrator who was able to take a down-and-out army with morale that all but collapsed, and in just a few months rejuvenated it, rebuilt it, and was able to proclaim it the finest army on the entire planet, only to discover that at least for 1 week in May, it was the second finest army on the planet. But he was a brilliant administrator. He had created an army that had a very unique dynamic to it. Unlike any other army that I've ever encountered in history, the Army of the Potomac is that rare quality that gets stronger through defeat rather than come unraveled. Now, as for his leadership on the field, he was ultra secretive. He did not engage his subordinates. He gave them pronunciamentos rather than talking to them and engaging them. He was given to such verbose statements as, "I hope God has mercy on Robert E. Lee, for I shall have none." A lot of Union commanders really regretted that he had said that. As one pointed out, fighting Robert E. Lee was tough enough. We didn't need him and the Almighty. One other quality I might point out about General Hooker is that on that tremendous bloodletting day of May 3rd, General Hooker was struck down by Union or Confederate artillery fire. He was on the front porch of the Chancellorsville house when a shell struck the pillar he was leaning against. It hurled him from the second floor out into the yard, and then the pillar landed on top of him and squashed him like a bug. About 500 pounds of wood had to be pulled off of him, and he was badly concussed. Staff officers reported that they found him more dead than alive, and they took him off into the woods and tried to revive him, but he was badly incapacitated. He had a concussion in a day and age that didn't recognize concussion, so they didn't handle it. When Joe Hooker falls at Chancellorsville, he joins a very unique fraternity. In the American Civil War, only 7 Army commanders ever fell shot, wounded, killed while commanding an army in battle. Now, that should alarm us to one degree that 7 Army commanders did in the course of 4 years. But the amazing thing is, he's one of those 7. As a brain teaser, you now have to go home and start Googling to find out who the other 6 are. Yes.
Sir, there was another Lexingtonian and my professor there that day. His fortunes didn't turn out very well. Would you comment on Raleigh Colston?
Raleigh Colston was a fellow who Stonewall Jackson, even on his deathbed, desired to see him promoted to a major general dated May 2nd in honor of the flank attack and its huge success. But General Colston, unfortunately, was not blessed with that ability. He was not going to get the promotion. He was not going to stay with the Army of Northern Virginia. Part of the problem was that his corps, or rather his division in Jackson's corps, was badly twisted up and pulled apart in the maelstrom of May 3rd. His brigades were gutted, and his leadership was lacking. Some people could use the cult of personality to jump into a breach and try to hold things together personally. Colston was not that personality. He was dealing with brigades that were now on their 5th commander. So as a result, even those commands didn't know who was in charge at any given moment. And as he tried to talk to those commanders, how do you find them when nobody knows who it is? That was going to be a strike against him. The other strike that's going to be against him is not direct, it's indirect. And that is that there were other generals who were coming back to the Army, who had been recuperating, who had been protégés of Stonewall Jackson in the field. And they had already acquired a reputation for being reliable, stalwarts, combat-effective commanders. And if Robert E. Lee had an opportunity to use Edward Johnson, he was going to use a man that had already proven himself, rather than invest in a man who had yet to have that chance. So I don't say that it's any direct smear or dash against Raleigh Colston, but I do say that it does speak well of Edward Johnson, his replacement. And one question here.
Yes, I'd be interested in if you could elaborate a little bit on General Lee's death. You said it occurred close to here, but what happened? I know he got hurt calls, but what the specifics?
Robert E. Lee was troubled by a failing heart starting in 1863 that would carry him right through to literally his last gasping hour. He confessed at one point in 1869 to one of the students here that he was suffering from a terminal illness, old age. And he left it at that. But in fact, he knew that his time was limited. At the end of 1869, the beginning of 1870, Lee went on a grand tour of the South, kind of a farewell, final goodbye. And then he came back here to resume his administrative duties as best he could. The college was deathly afraid that he would leave because of his health. But he continued and persevered and soldiered on. He finished with his business in the office here at the chapel, went home for a brief meal, then went to the Episcopal Church for a meeting, and when he came back, he sat with his daughter, and then he suddenly became quite sick and lost his ability to speak. He was bedridden for several days. It rained terribly in the middle of October. I know that's hard for us to imagine. And then, just as yesterday, in the afternoon, the sun came out. And it's at that point that Lee uttered, "Strike the tent." And he did. He closed his eyes in sleep and was gone. Lee had fought his last battle against his most overwhelming opponent, himself, his heart. And that was a battle that even Robert E. Lee could not win. But as he had surrendered at Appomattox with tremendous dignity, he had surrendered his life up in the president's house, just beneath the great bay window that overstretches the wraparound porch, with that same dignity. There's few people in the world who get that gift, to live a dignified life and to end it with that same profound dignity. That's something that I could only hope for all of us. Thank you.